Hello, and welcome to this episode of Strange as It Seems, a podcast about history, occultism, espionage, secret societies, mystery, conspiracy, and weirdness high and low. The common denominator is that the topics all embody the strange, that is, something that's unusual or surprising in a way that's unsettling or hard to understand. The aim is to reveal and discuss, but without any definite expectation of explaining or proving anything. Because, more often than not, the closer you look at the strange, the stranger it gets. Well, here we are, Stephen, for another episode of Strange as It Seems. So, a little boilerplate to get out of the way. We are coming up on 2,000 subscribers, which isn't much, but it was more than it was before. Enough to encourage us, rightly or wrongly. And also about 100,000 downloads. So we're reaching some kind of threshold for which, one, I want to thank all of the subscribers. And if you're listening and you're not subscribed, then please do, because apparently that's the way these things work. And we must bow to the powers that be to move forward. So, what are we going to be talking about today? Well, we're going to be talking, and let me set this up. Our last episode was about the Order of the Green Dragon, which I was pretty enthusiastic about, but I did not expect it to really attract as much attention as it did. I mean, I'm glad about that. But it's one of these things that you wonder from this end, why did this attract more interest than the other one did? So I'm happy that it did. And trying to shamelessly capitalize on that, our topic for today isn't exactly a sequel to the Order of the Green Dragon, but it does sort of spin off from that. There is a connection to it in a degree. So hopefully, if you found the Green Dragon interesting, you'll find today's topic interesting, and that is the Merchant of Death himself, the early 20th century's mystery man of Europe, Basil Zaharoff. Now, right away, we have a question. Is his surname pronounced Zaharoff or Zaharoff? Well, you'll hear it both ways. And since he's dead, and everyone who knew him is dead, we don't know. But I'm going to go with Zaharoff, although if on occasion I slip and say Zaharoff, that's because for years that's the way I pronounced it, so that may come back. So maybe you've heard of Basil Zaharoff, maybe you haven't. So let me start out, assuming that he's largely an unknown quantity, as to why he's worthy of an episode. Why are we talking about him? And also, what could he possibly have to do with the Green Dragon Society? Well, unlike the Green Dragon Society, Basil Zaharoff is definitely real. He existed. I'm not aware of anyone who questions that. You can question everything else about him, but he is real. His presence, his influence is certainly real. How far that goes, well, that's one of the things that we'll get to. So, Basil Zaharoff is most often spoken of, the term Merchant of Death will give you an idea, as the preeminent, if nothing else, he was the preeminent arms and munition salesman from, let's say, the 1890s up really until the 1920s.
Munition salesman for himself?
No, for the companies, mostly for Vickers, British Vickers. But he also worked for Nordenfelt, which was a Swedish company, for Maxim. And we'll get into there's a lot of sort of business details that go on. But he started out doing a number of things. Petty theft, setting fires, possibly working as a brothel tout. Okay, there are all sorts of stories about his early life. But what he's known for is arguably being one of, if not maybe in terms of sheer amount of money, earned the most successful weapons salesman in history. And he had a particular method in doing it. It's a thing called the system. Le Système Zaharoff. And we'll explain what his system was. But let me actually start out with what his arguable connection is with the whole Green Dragon mythos. So, if you haven't seen that episode, or rather, listen to that episode. You'd have to stare at a blank. If you haven't heard that episode, then you'd need to go back and do it. But if you have, you might remember that one of the key figures, one of the minor mysteries in that, is this fellow, the man with the green gloves. So you've got the two protagonists in the story, which are Teddy Legrand and James Nobody, and they're trying to hunt down the nefarious activities of the Green Dragon. And this eventually leads them to Berlin and to the lair of someone called the Man with the Green Gloves. Now, again, part of much of the story seems to suggest that that was a Berlin stage psychic and Nazi supporter, Jewish Nazi supporter, oddly enough, by the name of Erich Jan Hannessen. The story, the novel version of the story ends with this being a kind of almost cartoonish Fu Manchu character. But there's a little part of the story that, just for the sake of time and simplicity, that I didn't mention, and that's that Legrand and Nobody, the two heroes of the story, ostensibly, meet with the Man with the Green Gloves in order to meet with someone else. There's a bigger figure in the background, and that is the Man with the two Z's.
Oh, come on, dude.
Yes, the Man with the two Z's. Why does nobody have an ordinary name? I don't know. Probably because it's a pulp novel.
Yeah.
But the Man with the two Z's is their ultimate goal. And this is the Man with the Green Gloves, is to introduce them to the Man with the two Z's. And they're to meet with him in Berlin. So who is this character? And again, there's sort of two different possibilities. It's ambiguous. So one assumption is that since this is in Berlin, and since it's taking place in 1930, 31, 32, early 1930s, that they're being set up to meet with who could possibly, what are the two Z's? Well, one argument is that this is Hitler. And why is it Hitler? Because this swastika, his chosen symbol, is, again, if you look at it in the right way and you deconstruct it, it's two Z's. Roughly. Not exactly, but roughly. And that would seem to fit the possibility. One of the things that's presented in the novel is that Hitler somehow is a tool or a member of the Green Dragon Society, and that his rise to power is being abetted or orchestrated by them. So that would fit. But there's another possibility. And actually, a number of things in the story point in that direction as opposed to Hitler, and that the Man with the two Z's is Basil Zaharoff. Why? Well, because his nickname, the name that he was generally known by among his associates, his intimates, was ZZ, ZZ, literally the Man with two Z's. Now, why would they be meeting with him? What does he have to do with the Green Dragon Society? Well, because he's also, so there's this, you can see it in the thumbnail for the Green Dragon episode, and there's this sort of dragon-like thing, and it's got all these little thin necks and heads sticking off of it. And one of the games to play is at who those heads represent. Some of them you can name, some of them are less certain. So I think way over on the left-hand side is Hitler. You know, it's pretty clear. He's got a mustache and a swastika on his hat. But next to him, you'll see a figure with what appears to be a very tall conical hat. That's a fez, very fancy fez. That is Basil Zaharoff. Now, is that because he's a Turk? No. He's actually, as far as we can tell, a Greek. But he's a Greek born in Turkey, Therefore, they put a fez to recognize him. So he's there. Both of them, if this is a tip-off as to who the characters are that are being talked about in the novel or in the story, Zaharoff and Hitler are there, and they're right next to each other. Something else that would somewhat strengthen that theory, that the man with the two Z's is Basil Zaharoff, ZZ, and not Hitler, is that Zaharoff was also suspected by people who had nothing to do with the Green Dragon or with the novel upon which this story is derived. People like the French occultist René Guénon was convinced, and Guénon gets convinced of a lot of things, it has to be said. He was convinced that Basil Zaharoff was the most important occult adept in Europe. That he was somehow this kind of leader of this Rosicrucian, Theosophist, Illuminati, secret Masonic lodge of some kind. It's even Guénon doesn't seem to know exactly what he's talking about. But he thinks that Zaharoff, and that the whole secret to Zaharoff's influence and his power wasn't his money, but was the power that he gained and used through his role as this occult leader. And that's why, arguably, Legrand and nobody would have wanted to meet with him, because he arguably was the guy at the top. Now, the interesting thing about that is that the supposition that the character, at least as originally imagined in the story, is Zaharoff and not Hitler, that oddly seems to coincide with what Guénon, who's completely off in his own little world, believes was Zaharoff's role. But I think one way to think about it, putting that aside, is that if there is or was an Illuminati, and here I'm talking about the Illuminati as popularly imagined as, well, what? Some sort of occult society, some sort of secret lodge, some sort of Congress of the Secret Masters, however you want to imagine it. But if there is an Illuminati in that sense, then Basil Zaharoff must have been a member of it. And if he wasn't, well, he certainly should have been. The other thing about Zaharoff's role is that it resembles the roles played by other people. And let me bring things up for an example, a more current example, who's in the news a lot and people like to talk about all the time, Jeffrey Epstein. So one of the things about Epstein, if you simply look at him as an individual, if you look at his origins and his progression through life, there's nothing particularly exceptional about it. I mean, Epstein was a kind of suburban, Long Island high school kid who started out supposedly by making money in high school by doing other people's math homework. He was good at math. A lot of other people aren't. And so he was one of those good at math kids who could earn a little extra money by doing homework for the jocks, whoever didn't want. Now, enterprising, slightly immoral. And Epstein's progression through life isn't because he was born into wealth or power. He's not. Epstein is, in his origin, a nobody. He is unexceptional. His one apparent skill is that he's good at math, and that's also not something that makes him unique in the world. Other people are as well. But other people don't become what Epstein became. And if you look at Epstein's career, this may be an episode all on its own in the future, but if you look at his career, to keep it simple, he advances in life by ingratiating himself to people who are wealthy and powerful. He gets a job at a prestigious prep school, is eventually fired from that job, but it has made friends with the rich parents of some of those kids, and he then goes to work for Bear Stearns. He then bails on that just before it goes under. And what really gets him going is that this is what Epstein did. This is how he built his business. He taught people how to evade taxes. Tax avoidance, tax dodging was what he was good at. He also was very good at helping already wealthy people hide money or to find money, to recover money that might have been lost, accounts that had gone dormant in one form or another. So he wasn't born into a position of wealth and influence. He became important by becoming a useful tool for people who had wealth and influence, until apparently he became a problem. Mm-hmm. And then that problem, in one way or the other, was solved. And you can believe that's because he was either offed himself, or he was done away with, take your pick. Or there's always the third theory, is that he's alive somewhere on another island. Okay, he was bought off in that regard. And Epstein certainly became involved in highly questionable activities, which included, it looks like he was collecting a lot of intelligence on important people. For what purpose? There's only one economic value to that type of information, and that's leverage. Notice I didn't say blackmail. Leverage. To blackmail someone, you actually have to present them with the threat of exposure. Leverage is simply them knowing that you have the means of exposure, and nobody ever has to mention that unpleasant word, blackmail. Now, that said, Basil Zaharoff is similar in this respect. He begins life, so far as we can tell, as pretty much a nobody, a person of no particular, certainly not a person of any wealth. His father might or might not have been a reasonably successful cloth merchant, but still not part of the high and the mighty. But the other intriguing thing about Zaharoff, and you find this, I remember one of the people who I talked about in a past episode was Sidney Riley, my sort of personal obsession. Mm. And that one of the things about Riley, also a person who becomes important or useful to powerful and influential people in one way or another, is that his background, his origin, his original name is obscure. I mean, it's not just obscure, it's obscured. The thing isn't just like somebody forgot who he was. He's hidden who he was. And exactly the same thing is true for Zaharoff. Now here's the best you can put things together. Zaharoff, by his own declarations at one point in time or another, was either born in 1849 or in 1850 or in 1851 or in 1852. I suspect he was born in 1859 because, having looked at similar things before, people almost always tend to make themselves younger over time as opposed to older. But born somewhere around, what we could agree upon, he was born somewhere around 1850. But somehow not quite sure what year it was. He also, by at least the only kind of written record of his birth, the only piece of paper that ever attests to his appearance in the world, says that he was born on the 6th of October in 1849 in what was then the Ottoman Empire. Now keep in mind, the Ottoman Empire, Turkish Empire, at this time in the 19th century, spanned much of the Balkans and the Near East. So everything that was Turkey and much of the Balkans, Syria, Palestine, Israel, Lebanon, Iraq, all of that was parts of Arabia were all part of this sprawling Ottoman Empire. And while it was a Turkish empire, it embraced many different peoples. And the Greeks were quite an important part of that. And Zaharoff was born in western Anatolia, what would today be western sort of Aegean coastline Turkey, but which at this time was largely populated by Greeks. So there was a country of Greece that had been part of the Ottoman Empire, but that had broken away. So there were Greeks and there were Ottoman Greeks. They were scattered over a very wide area. So he was an ethnic Greek born in the Turkish Ottoman Empire, which made him a Greek and also an Ottoman political subject. Those things will become arguably important as we go down the road. If the story is true, because this document basically appeared around 1911 in France when Zaharoff was applying to become a French citizen. He was seeking French citizenship. And one of the things that was demanded of him was some sort of ID. I mean, who are we giving French citizenship to? Well, we need some sort of paperwork. Well, the paperwork appeared. And how did it appear? Well, Zaharoff sent some of his people off to western Anatolia, to the little town of Mushlu or Mukhla, which was supposedly his birthplace. And as the story goes, they found an old Greek Orthodox priest. Now, the Greek Orthodox priest vaguely remembered, I can't recall whether he remembered this or he remembered someone else, but he wrote out he swore out an affidavit in which he said that, yes, I know, or at least I remember, that Zaharoff was born in Mukhla on the 6th of October, 1849, and I attest that this is true, and I am a priest of the Holy Orthodox Church. So you have to believe me. Well, again, it turned out, somebody else investigated this, that the priest wasn't swearing to anything that he knew for a fact, that he was basically repeating, and that the actual church where those records were held had burned to the ground sometime earlier. And this was one of the problems that someone pointed. If you went looking into Zaharoff's background, trying to find any kind of actual documentation of anything, it became very difficult. There was no there. Or so what you had here was, decades later, someone who can't attest to the actual facts simply swears on the basis that they're a priest, that they heard this. They never actually saw Zaharoff face to face, nothing. So a lot of people questioned as to whether or not this was an authentic birth certificate. It is highly questionable. On the other hand, it seems, if you put all the different, there were people who would argue that he's not a Greek at all. Okay, so the next big choice was that, some people argued he was an Armenian, or he was a Georgian, or he was a Russian, or a Bulgarian, or a Romanian, or maybe an Albanian. Pick a Balkan nationality, and all of them could have been there. Later on, people noticed that he spoke Russian better than he spoke Greek. Now, he explained that by the fact that, well, first of all, his surname, Zaharoff, which as we'll see he doesn't adopt until some years later, is Russian. He argues it's essentially the Russianized version of Zacharias or Zachariadis. That at some point his family went over and they lived in the Russian Empire for a while, and his dad decided to Russianize the name, and then when they later went back to Greece or to Turkey, they just kept it that way. But no one is quite convinced of that either. Why would he speak Russian better than he spoke Greek? Well, he just had more reason to use it. He was also, there were those, and you'll still find those who insist that no, he was actually Jewish. And in fact, also around 1911, 1910 in England, a guy pops up, a Jewish immigrant from Russia, who claims that, yes, Basil Zaharoff, the famous arms merchant, the merchant of death, is actually my long-lost daddy. He abandoned our family in 1877 and ran off somewhere, and I'd recognize him anywhere. And this guy actually changed his name from Sakhar to Zaharoff, and then billed himself. Zaharoff never recognized this, never, pretended the guy didn't exist. Now, was this just a con man who was trying to capitalize by claiming to be the son of a famous man of dubious origin, or was there something to that? It's different versions of the same story. But what this signals to me is that it's not just a matter of confusion. Because Zaharoff eventually would attain the position and the wealth and influence that if for some reason he didn't know who he was, he could have figured it out. There's no reason for that to have remained obscure. The reason why his origins are cloudy, the reason why you get these different stories, is because that's the way that he wanted it to be. He wanted his past, his origins, to be as occulted as possible. Because, presumably, that did not aid in his then current and future endeavors. So, what Basil Zaharoff, see there I did it. What Basil Zaharoff represents is one of these characters in history, one of these kind of, we'll call them mystery men. There are probably some mystery women who fall into this as well. They're people who just emerge out of the fog, sort of night and fog. They appear in the world. They take different forms, often under different names, eventually coalesce under a known identity. Riley, remember, originally Rosenblum, but before that something else, is a symptom of the same sort of disease, for lack of a better term. And that Zaharoff is a person who rises to great power and prominence, but through, in this way, obscures his origins. The backstory just becomes whatever version you prefer to accept. So, the first place that you can, one of the things I like to look for in terms of research is, okay, where's the first place we can pin this guy down? When does he actually sort of show up? Remember, we got all these different stories, and one of the stories is that actually he's Greek. I have to say that if you put most of the pieces together, they seem to overwhelmingly point in the direction of him having Greek ethnicity. He seems to have a particular attachment to Greeks and later to the kingdom of Greece, to Greeks generally. I mean, was that just one of those things he was feigning? Was he just pretending to be Greek? That's possible. But if you put most of the pieces together, the constant indication is that he is a Greek. Now, whether he was born in Mukhla or Mushlu, or whether, as other people argued, he was born in Constantinople. In fact, from the Greek or Fenar quarter, the lighthouse quarter of Constantinople, Istanbul, for those today, the capital of the Ottoman Empire. So there are different stories, and one is that he actually started out in life, he grew up in poverty. He was, as a teenager, he became a tout for a brothel, or a house of prostitution. He was one of the young men who would stand out in front and go, hey, come in, check out the girls, all right? Possible. Another was that he was a petty thief, ran with a gang of petty thieves who robbed houses, sold things on the black market. Another was that he was a member of the infamous Constantinople Fire Brigade. Now, fires broke out in the city, and there was a fire brigade, a kind of private organization that fought fires, but that wasn't really how they made their money. They made their money by starting fires. You needed something burned down, these guys would do it for you. Then they would actually show up and put it out, possibly, and you pay them for that. Or the real way they made money was that you paid them to make sure that fires didn't start.
Yeah.
So they were firemen, arsonists, and a protection racket all rolled into one. That was a real organization. Whether he was a part of it, well, we don't know. What's interesting is that later on, people said that he was, or believed that he was in this regard, because, as we'll see, he has a rather wide moral conscience. So one of the things you notice early on in the case of Basil Zaharoff is that he's willing to commit crimes in pursuit of livelihood, of advancing himself. So, yet others argue that he was a Greek, but he was actually from Athens, not from Constantinople. So, again, which of these stories do you want to have? Here's a kind of interesting quote from one of his later biographers. And it wasn't really until you get into the late 20s or 1930s that anybody ever actually tries to assemble a biography. This was a German journalist by the name of Robert Neumann. And he sort of describes it this way. Zaharoff did everything he could to confuse the picture. You ask for his birth certificate? Alas, a fire destroyed the church registers. You search for a document concerning him in the archives of the Vienna War Office? The folder is there, but it's empty. You obtain permission to inspect the papers of a law case. The papers are requested, but alas, no one in the office can find them. So, where does he show up? The first place you can really kind of pin him down, if I can find the right page here, is in London in 1872. Now, by this time, he'd be in his early 20s, 22, 23. But remember, not in Athens, not in Constantinople, not anywhere else, but in London. And the way that you find him is through a public record. There are 3 different little records in that year. First, in 1872, he changed, or rather he applied to change his name. And he was then known under the name of Z.B. Zaharoff. Now, what did the Z.B. stand for? Probably Zachariah Basileos. Okay? Zachariah or Zacharias Basileos Zaharoff. He also gave an address of 41 Threadneedle Street. Remember that. That's kind of important. We'll come back to that. He is described in the application as a merchant and interpreter. So he was engaged in business, and his interpreting was presumably between Greek and English, which now raises another interesting question. He's about 22 years old. Where did he learn English? That was not as widely known then as it was today, but he had to have learned that somewhere, presumably in a school. What school? Now, again, later on there are stories that, well, he had a rich uncle who paid for him to go to an English school in Athens, or maybe it was an English school in Constantinople, or maybe it was an English school in England. In fact, maybe it was rugby school. Okay. Yeah, that was it. It was rugby school. And Zaharoff himself would later claim that he had gone to rugby. He'd also claimed to have graduated from Oxford. He did neither. Now, here's the interesting thing. In the 1920s, when he's rich and famous, and he makes a statement to the press that he had gone to rugby, someone, of course, went to rugby school and asked them. What did they say? Now, he didn't. They later admitted they hadn't. He'd never been there. They said, oh, yes, we remember him well. Why? Because from rugby's standpoint, it reflected well upon them that the famous, the powerful, and the mysterious Basil Zaharoff was a graduate of our fine institution. So he lied about going to rugby, and then because it served rugby's interests, they lied to support his lie. So this is one of the interesting things, again, I think, about the whole career of Basil Zaharoff. If you follow the little pieces, if you follow the breadcrumbs as they go through the woods, I'd argue that his life reveals many of the secret ways in which the world actually works.
Oh, okay.
And one of the things that will make the world work, one of the occult elements, and I'm not talking about spooky occult, I'm talking about the hidden portions of it, is that one, people lie, and that other people support those lies for their own self-interest. But he did learn, we come back to the undeniable fact. Where he learned English, we don't know, but he learned it somewhere. Relatively few Greeks, his age, would have been expert enough, would have been enough of a polyglot in those 2 languages to be able to be employed as an interpreter. but he was. Now, what's the significance of that address on 41 Threadneedle Street? Well, Threadneedle Street is the heart of the British Empire's Wall Street. That is in the city.
City of London.
The Bank of England, the old lady of Threadneedle Street, is just down the block. So this, again, would be like saying, if it was in the U.S., that he had an address on Wall Street or on Whitehall or one of the places in the financial district. So here he is. He's 22, 23 years old. He speaks English, and he is working as a merchant and interpreter in the heart of Britain's, not just Britain's, the British Empire's financial capital. Mm-hmm. How did he get there? Who does he know? Now, again, there are a couple of stories. One, again, was that his father is part of it. That his father, who was Basileos Zacharias, or Basileos Zachariadis, was a cloth merchant, and that he did business back and forth to England, and that's how his son ended up there. That's something like that. But in other cases, no, it's his uncle, that he had a rich uncle.
There's always a rich uncle.
There's always a rich uncle, right? And the rich uncle, a name is given for the rich uncle in some cases, a last name, Ephistidi or Ephistidis. And it turns out there really was a wealthy merchant in both Athens and Constantinople by the name of Ephistidis. So that may be a clue to who his actual family was. So Zaharoff is an English interpreter. He's living in the center of the financial district. But then, what was he going to change his name to? So he wanted to go from being Z.B. Zaharoff. Well, he changed his name to Zacharias Basileos Gotsakov. No, not Zaharoff, Gotsakov. And furthermore, described himself as a General de Kiev. That is, a Russian imperial military officer from Kiev. Remember, Kiev wasn't, Ukraine was part of Russia at the time. And the next thing he does is that he marries a young English woman by the name of Emily Ann Burroughs, and he marries her as Zacharias Basileos Gotsakov. So why is he changing his name? Well, one of the reasons why people change their name is that they want to distance themselves from the name prior to that. What had he done that it might be necessary to do it? But they were married. It's there's a registry for it in All Saints Church in Westminster. Nice place to be married. Now, the question is, why did he try to restyle himself, he, a Greek interpreter, as a Russian officer and nobleman? Because that's what he's claiming. Well, what happened next might explain that. The marriage was noted in the newspapers. And even in far-off Constantinople, a certain Ephistidi, a certain Monsieur Ephistidi, the same name supposedly given by his uncle, read this and decided that this was his rotten nephew who had absconded with goods and money, who had essentially stolen from him and had run off to London and sold things which did not belong to him. And Ephistidi sent lawyers to London, and they had Zaharoff, or General Gotsakov, arrested. Now, raised a complaint, and you now had Zaharoff, we'll just stick with that name, which is now facing a trial and judge in the Old Bailey. The case is actually mentioned in the press. A felony charge of larceny was first lodged against him, and then that was dropped over some question of jurisdiction as to where, had these goods been stolen in London? That's where they'd been sold, apparently, but they've been taken in Constantinople, and could a British court really deal with that? So in January 1873, the plaintiff, who in the court records is listed as Zacharias Basileos Zaharoff, so now he seems to have gone back to his other name. So did he ever fully change it to begin with?
Yeah.
We don't know. By the way, there is an application to change his name. There is not another actual record that the name was changed. He pled guilty to a misdemeanor charge of making consignment of goods entrusted to him, selling something that didn't belong to him. And he then put up a 100-pound bond and was bound over for sentencing. Now, a 100-pound bond doesn't sound like much, but in that period of time, that's actually equivalent today of about $15,000 to $20,000. So he put up a fair amount of money as bond. And then what did he do? Did he wait around to be sentenced? No, he vanished.
Yeah.
He disappears from London. Gone.
Wife.
By the way, he also abandons his wife in the process.
All right.
So he's gone. And then where does he show up next? Well, next he surfaces in Cyprus. He's back down next to Turkey and Greece. Cyprus was then, it belonged to the Ottomans still, but the British were kind of moving in. And in Cyprus, he's carrying a British passport, a legitimate British passport, in the name of Z.Z. Williamson. Z.Z. Williamson. This is where the Z.Z. come. What does the Z.Z. stand for? I'm going to suppose Zacharias, or something similar to that.
Easier
But now
to
he's
say.
Z.Z. Williamson. He's got a passport. And here, for those who've seen the Spies episode we did, I want to note the fact that this is identical to what will be the change in the way in which Sigmund Rosenblum becomes Sidney Riley a couple of decades later. Same sort of things happen. Rosenblum is an informant for Scotland Yard, gets into some legal issues that compromise him, and is just handed a new passport in the name of Sidney George Riley and is sent off to the Far East. So this is what's happened here. He gets himself into some legal trouble. He's now given somebody, he is given, notice this, the passive voice here, he is just given this. Well, someone gave it to him, and who do you get a legitimate British passport from at a fake name? Someone in authority in London. So this is a key sign to me that even at this point, even in the early 1870s, in his early 20s, that Zaharoff has some kind of in with British imperial authorities. That's how he gets a new name, a new identity, and goes off to Cyprus. It's also interesting that in Cyprus, he teams up. He works there again as a commercial merchant, but he works with a fellow by the name of William Shaw. And William Shaw was a British tradesman who traveled around the Near East. He also was a British political and intelligence agent. Mm-hmm. So you get a passport and a new name. You go to Cyprus and you're working with a British spook.
Yeah.
All right. How many more signs do you need to have that something is going on here? So, in fact, one of Zaharoff's friends, a Greek friend by the name of Dino Xenopoulos, will later explain things this way. He goes, in London, Zaharoff had tried to ingratiate himself in intelligence circles, not without some success. The trial for theft had been a setback in one sense, but in another it had enabled him to invoke help from those same intelligence sources who, to some extent at least, caused him to be dealt with leniently. Zaharoff needed a new alias. Intelligence work on the British side provided it for him. And I would think that's exactly what happened. The question is why? What services had he done that had been valuable for them? What, as a merchant and interpreter, remember, as a 22-year-old merchant and interpreter, had ingratiated yourself with British intelligence? We don't know. We only see the results. Now, in Cyprus, he's known through his passport as in the name of Z.Z. Williamson. But it turns out he also has a side business. He's buying real estate. All the real estate he can get his hands on. With money that is unclear where that comes from.
Where's that come from?
And he's not doing it under the name of Z.Z. Williamson. No, he's doing it under the name of Zacharias Vasilios Zachariadis. Yet another version on his name. So he's buying up the land, but in some way the purchasing of this land is not to be connected with his normal business activities.
Is there any significance to where he's buying in Cyprus?
Mostly around ports, around Famagusta. Okay. Well, one of the things that's going to happen is that in 1873, when he shows up in Cyprus, Cyprus is still Ottoman territory.
Okay.
In 1876, there's going to be a big kerfuffle in the Balkans. There's going to be a thing called the Russo-Turkish War.
Okay.
A brouhaha, if you will.
There you go.
And as a result of that, there's going to be all kinds of territories going to change hands. And in 1876, Cyprus will become a British protectorate. Still technically the Ottomans, but now the British are going to run the place. And now they have all this land, which someone has already appropriately bought for them.
Okay.
And some of this land, by the way, is then sold to create a British military base on Cyprus. Cyprus also hovers. You have to look at a map, and you have to look at Cyprus and look what's right below it. Egypt.
Yeah.
And the next place the British are going to take over is Egypt. So this is a kind of
island hopping, sort of.
So we're going to assume he was sent off and was working with Shah to do just that, to essentially prepare for the eventual British control of Cyprus, or at least it certainly looks that way. Now, one of the other things that his business partner Shah did is that Shah was also the local representative for the Swedish Nordenfelt Guns and Ammunition Company. So Nordenfelt was based in Stockholm. And Nordenfelt, among other things, was a competitor with Hiram Maxim in the invention of the machine gun.
Okay.
So it was a Nordenfelt gun, and then there was the Maxim gun. And they're competing with each other. And one of the whole things about competition was that, well, merger. Okay. Rather than compete, why don't we just merge? Which is eventually what will happen. Yeah. Nordenfelt and Maxim will be merged into a single company. So Shah disappears from the scene around 1877. And he hands over his role as salesman, local Middle East salesman for Swedish weaponry, to his partner Williamson, or Zachariadis, or whatever name he's using at that particular time. And Zaharoff then went into that business, and he would announce to people he was doing business with that not only did he represent the Nordenfelt Company, but he also had he knew a lot of important people in London, and in fact had connections to British intelligence. And that might be another reason, well, either to do business or to avoid business with him. Now, here's another character comes in that has some connection to the Green Dragon Society. If you saw that episode, you might remember that among so many other things, one of the questions in terms of the novel Seven Heads of the Green Dragon is who wrote it. Okay, one of the things agreed upon is that Teddy Legrand, the supposed author, is a pseudonym. And the two main contenders for authorship are two Frenchmen. One is a guy by the name of Pierre Mariel. The other is a fellow by the name of Javier d'Hautecloque. Now, interestingly enough, that very same Javier d'Hautecloque was an investigative journalist writer who was in some ways kind of obsessed with Basil Zaharoff. And one of the things that he did in the early 1930s was to write an expose, one of the first sort of exposés of Zaharoff. And it's Hautecloque who argues, again, fairly persuasively, that Zaharoff was from an early age a British agent. He notes the fact that he was young, brave, physically attractive, and could speak numerous languages. That came in handy. Plus, the most important thing was that he had a very broad moral conscience. He was willing to commit. Remember, one of the first places we see him is him on trial for theft. So you can go back to all of these stories about him being a brothel tout or an arsonist, but the one thing that we do know is that in Atlanta, actually he ends up pleading guilty to selling stuff that wasn't his. So that is there. But the other thing that Hautecloque mentions is Zaharoff's connection with Near Eastern Freemasonry. Now here again is a rabbit hole that's just opened up, and it is wide and dark. So we're not going to go down too deep. But Suffice to say that, as in the rest of Europe, in the Near East, that is in Egypt and Cyprus, in the Ottoman Empire and in the Balkans, there were Masonic lodges. These were in many ways quite different from lodges that you would find in Western Europe. They're often vaguely associated with the French or Italian Grand Orient Rite. Many of them, however, have protection, have a kind of relationship with British lodges. Therefore, some have argued that these lodges were then used as a kind of hidden hand of British influence. There's probably something to that as well. But the most important thing about them for our present discussion is that these lodges were highly political. They're almost all connected to some kind of Remember, the Near East, the decaying Ottoman Empire, the Balkans, is just awash in crazed nationalism. So all of these, Bulgaria, Greece, Serbia, Montenegro, Albania, all of the little countries are clawing their way out of imperial servitude to create independent states. They hate each other. There are wars that are going on. And these lodges is where much of this activity takes place. So they are, they're not just associations for fellowship. They are clearly centers of political conspiracy. And one of the things that things like national insurrections and wars of independence need are what? Weapons and ammunition. Remember, you're going to have both. The weapons are no good. The rifles are no good unless you have bullets. The bullets are no good unless you have the rifles. And there you have. So Otterklok argued that Zaharoff's whole sort of career as an arms merchant is connected to this kind of Masonic Near Eastern underground combined with his connection with British intelligence.
I was pause real quick. I was going to ask you about that. So, in the history of all these, at least modern intelligence, there's always somebody, we've talked about with Chrisman, the octopus murders, which is on, the Netflix thing, which is vaguely, he's got associates kind of in that. There's always these kind of dubious moral figures, but arms dealing always shows up. Now, I'm assuming arms dealing because you need arms to fight a war, as you were saying. But in this case, if he's paving the way for the Brits to come in to Cyprus through acquisition of land, that's what I was wondering where he was buying land, if it was residential real estate, if it was by a port, which I think makes a difference. Is there a history of those kind of figures, these arms dealers, these kind of black hand type figures who are working in tandem with intelligence, maybe as an asset? Is there a pattern there as far as they're exercising their influence through these organizations, these occult organizations, by this basically selling arms in preparation for a regime change type situation? Is that what intelligence organizations tend to do, or is it just kind of an opportunistic, we'll just sell some arms because we need to make Iran-Contra, right? We're going to arm stuff like that.
Well, Iran-Contra is a good example. You've got the CIA, which is, what were they doing? They were smuggling coke in order to pay for weapons because Congress couldn't give them the money to buy the weapons to field a guerrilla army to overthrow a government, the Sandinista government in Nicaragua. Whether you think that was good or bad, that's what they were doing. And now for some people who involved in that, it was simply a matter of money, for the guys making the coke in Colombia that was selling it to them is purely a monetary exchange. The ultimate goal in all of this, from the standpoint of the CIA, was regime change in Nicaragua.
Yeah.
And to do that, you had to sell drugs. You had to use the drugs to buy weapons on the black market to arm a guerrilla army to fight a war to overthrow the Sandinistas. So the same thing is probably operating here. So you had, give you a rough approximation in the Balkans of this period. One of the things that crops up in the 1890s in the turbulent Balkans is a thing called the Internal Macedonian Revolutionary Organization, IMRO.
Nice.
And this was a group that aimed to free Macedonia from the rule of the Ottomans, with the ostensible idea of doing, well, it split into two groups. One wanted to unify with Bulgaria because they thought that Macedonia was naturally part of Bulgaria. But then there were other Macedonians who thought that, no, we're Macedonians. We don't want to be part of Bulgaria. We just want to be Macedonia. Mm-hmm. But Imro then engaged. It's really a kind of model for modern revolutionary national liberation movements. Okay, remember, they're not a country. They're an armed nationalist movement, and they acquire weapons and ammunition to wage a war against the Ottomans, but also to wage a war against their perceived enemies in Serbia and in Greece, and then to fight with each other.
Yeah.
They don't have any sources of income on their own. There's nothing much that, there's a little local blackmail they engage in, but one of the central questions is that where's the money to buy this arms and ammunition coming from, and who's supplying it? Well, the money's coming from somewhere else, and the guy who's generally supplying it is Basil Zaharoff.
Huh.
So, but we'll see how Zaharoff operates when we get to defining what his system is, and how he'll turn just occasional selling of a machine gun into, well, a vast enterprise.
Well, this goes, I was watching an interview with John Mearsheimer, right? The Tragedy of Great Power Politics. And something that IR theory doesn't really, purport to do is wrestle with the realists, even though they're called realists, they don't wrestle with intelligence communities and kind of how this stuff actually functions on the ground. So I was just wondering, if you're the British Empire, wouldn't you want to undermine this crumbling empire next door? And are you doing that through somebody like...
Well, I think the general perception, even by the 1870s, well, let's put it this way. The Ottomans essentially go bankrupt in the 1870s.
Yeah.
That's why there's a thing called the Ottoman Debt Commission. And the Ottoman debt, we go into way too much Balkan history here, but the Ottoman Empire is bankrupt, and so a bunch of foreign creditors come in and they take over your entire, your customs and tax service, so that now they control, your creditors control your national income. You don't even control that anymore. The Ottoman Empire is defunct. What the British want to do is to control the dissolution of the Ottoman Empire. You don't want it to collapse all at once, because that will then set off a feeding frenzy. The Russians will come in and grab stuff. Rather, you just want it to fall apart piece by piece. And this is why when you look at the Congress of Berlin, when you look at the 1876 settlement and so on, you can just see they just come in and they just cut away another piece of the Ottoman Empire, and everybody, the Brits take Cyprus, the Austro-Hungarians get Bosnia. Okay, you make a deal. The French, you'll get Tunisia. You can do that. That will keep everybody. They're just sort of carving up this territory. It's a controlled demolition of the Ottoman Empire. There's no interest in saving it. But the other reason you want to keep it around is that, remember, you're managing its debt. And if the Ottoman Empire disappears, who's going to take over its state debt? So the longer you can keep this corpse, this dead body on life support, the more you can simply milk it for the resources that it has available. Is this entirely immoral and ruthless? Yes, it is. It's also, secret of how the world actually works.
Yep.
So he's off, as Williamson or Zachariadis, he's doing business. He's now getting into arms sales in Cyprus. But then there's something else going on. Around 1876, a little article appears in an Athens newspaper, and it announces that one Zacharios Basileos Zaharoff had been shot dead while attempting to escape a local prison. Now, it could be somebody with the same name, but a lot of people in Athens who knew him assumed that it was him. There were inquiries from Zaharoff's family and friends, and this actually led to an exhumation of the body that was supposedly his, and it was determined that it was not his body. Somehow it was determined it was that of a Canadian sailor. Why is a Canadian sailor buried in a grave in Athens, supposedly having escaped from prison? Nobody could really answer that. Does this sound fishy? Well, yes, it certainly was. So Zaharoff himself later dismissed this as a dirty trick which was played by opponents, trying to screw with his business by making it look if it was dead. Others, however, even some of his friends, wondered if this wasn't some kind of plan he had to make it appear in certain quarters that he was dead. Another sort of change of identity. I'm going to kill off the whole Zaharoff identity. Maybe just go with Williamson or become someone else. That might have been it. Now, in any case, in 1879, Zaharoff returns briefly to England. Remember, he's still technically a fugitive. There's a warrant out for him there under at least one name or another. But while he's in London this period, there's a couple of interesting people that he meets with, and there are actual records of him meeting. One of them was Lord Salisbury, very important politician, I think headed the Conservative Party.
Was Salisbury tied up with Milner, the Milner group? I feel like that name.
I think Milner's kind of an extension of that. But Salisbury is a star in the British imperial firmament. Yeah. So why is this, again, lowly Greek interpreter, merchant, arms salesman meeting with Lord Salisbury? But then the other one is even more important. It's Nathaniel Rothschild.
Oh, jeez.
So now he's back in London and he's meeting with Salisbury and Rothschild. What do they want to talk to him about? Wow. How does he now get into that company? How does he even get into the front door of these places? How would he even get into the back door? But he is. Now, and this is the fact of a man who back on Cyprus is widely seen as a crook.
Yeah.
For one reason, but that doesn't seem to bother them. Now, the interesting thing is that he doesn't hang around London for long, probably because he would have been arrested. Where does he show up next? Where do you think he's going to surface next? Athens? Constantinople?
Russia.
New Delhi? No, Fort Wayne, Indiana. Because, yes, that's right, folks. Fort Wayne, Indiana. Because he gets on a boat and he heads across the pond and he goes to America. And he'll spend about the next 5 years in the U.S. Something that later on he never really wanted to talk about. So, in July 1882, the Fort Wayne newspaper noted that a certain ZZ, there it is again, ZZ Zaharoff Williamson, he now has a hyphenated name, yet another version of this, ZZ Zaharoff Williamson had arrived in town. He is described as a gentleman from London, England, and he was staying at a local hotel. Now, one of the things that he does in the U.S. is that he has a lot of money, and he goes around buying property in Texas.
Where in Texas?
Well, in Texas and New Mexico. So he tends he buys a ranch. He owns a cattle ranch. He also, what they mostly, and this is something that's I've seen before. There's another guy I've looked into by the name of Manby, the monster of Taos, New Mexico, who's this Englishman who shows up with a lot of money and starts buying land. And what they're often buying land for is what they think are the right-of-ways for railroads.
Well, the King Ranch and all those big, cattle operations that ended up, they were founded by the British for railroad purposes all throughout West Texas and stuff. This is about the same time.
Well, one of the Brits most active in this was a fellow who is the 7th Earl of Aylesford. And he and his associates, which included the Prince of Wales, future king, Eddie, are going around buying up a lot of land in the West, grazing land, but also very often looking for railroad right-of-ways, or for dams might be developed. There's a big dam that goes up in New Mexico, I think the Elephant Bluff Dam on the Rio Grande, which is financed by the Brits. So this is, Zaharoff is a bagman, basically.
Okay.
So now this is it. Let's go back a little bit. He goes to London. He's there. He meets with Rothschild in Salisbury, someone in political and financial authority. And then he next ends up in America, flush with a lot of money, and starts buying stuff. How much you want to bet that wasn't his money? So he's now, Zaharoff is traveling around the U.S., Texas. He's also in New York. He spends a good deal of time there. In New York, he had another guy, though. He styled himself an Egyptian fakir.
What?
Not a faker, a fakir. a kind of Egyptian mind reader who performed an act under the name of Zanat el-Zahan. Notice again, ZZ. So this is a whole other character he's inventing for himself. But then most of the time, when he wasn't being Zanat el-Zahan and reading people's minds, he styled himself as Count Zaharoff, a flamboyant, fez-wearing Russian nobleman whose visiting card identified him as an officer of the Russian Imperial Guard and aide-de-camp to His Majesty the Tsar of Russia.
Okay.
All total lies. But, this will play in Fort Wayne, Indiana. So, and I like the fez. He's a Russian wearing a fez, okay, pretending sometimes he's an Egyptian fakir. He gets a day job as the general secretary of the Man Boudoir Car Company. These were fancy train cars.
Okay.
Boudoir cars. Where you had your own sort of bedroom, private rail cars, which was a big thing. A sleeping car concern catering to lavish tastes of patrons. And one of the patrons, a woman that he was supposedly had an affair with, as Count Zaharoff, was Adelina Patti, who was an opera diva. Apparently a big deal. Okay, the Ariana Grande of her day, or something similar to that. Who insisted upon having a very fancy rail car, which he supplied to her. He's described in one report as a nobleman who had consented to accept an important executive position because of his disinclination to lead a life of idleness. So this is why he was slumming by simply being the general secretary of the Man Boudoir Car Company. So during this period, he's a totally fake count, but he was, toasted in hotels and in the best society from San Francisco to Broadway. But then in August 1885, he makes another mistake. Same as the first mistake he made. He got married, and this ended up in the press. And so there were announcements that reached all the way to London that Count Zaharoff had married an American heiress by the name of Jeannie Frances Billings. Well, who read that in London? The wife that he had abandoned back in 1873, Emily Burroughs. And she was, shall we say, pissed. And so she hired lawyers and private detectives. She came from a wealthy family to track down Zaharoff and get to the bottom of the whole thing. Well, he got wind of what was happening and decided that he and his new wife were going to leave New York, skip England, and go to Rotterdam in the Netherlands, where somehow he thought they wouldn't be able to touch him. Didn't work out that way. He was intercepted by swift-footed American detectives and eventually confronted with a very angry first wife, which of course he had never divorced. So his second wife found out this was a bigamous marriage. And he ends up losing both of them. And this makes a big mess, which was widely covered in the American press. So one of the things that becomes established out of this is that the name Zaharoff and bigamy and fraud are widely advertised in the U.S. And an interesting little detail is that so far as I can tell, Zaharoff never returns to America again, at least under that name. And this is, I've gone through shipping transit records, he never. That there are people who mention that they met him in Washington, New York during World War I or elsewhere, but if he did so, he did not travel under that name. An interesting story, and I have to put into the story, is that the reason why you never find him on liners is because he didn't travel that way. By the time you get to World War I, the way that he traveled across the Atlantic was on a Royal Navy destroyer.
I was about to say.
Okay. The Royal Navy provided him with a ship, and they sent him across.
Wow.
That way. Now, who gets that kind of treatment, you might ask? Think about it.
Amazing.
So, but that's, he quite tripped him. In fact, he's going to get married a third time, and that's not going to... Marriage is something that he should generally have avoided, one might say. Now, the odd thing is that by the time he eventually, this whole mess clears, and it's the late 1880s, and he's back in England, one of the things he finds, there's a lot of people there thought he was dead. They go, because he's been gone for 5 years. performing as a magician and land as a Russian count. So the story had apparently circulated in London from somewhere that he was dead. And the story is similar to that one that had him killed in Greece, except in this case, the story was that, what we heard is that you'd been killed escaping from a Persian prison. Okay. No, that didn't really happen either. Zaharoff again claimed he didn't know where that story came from. Now, there's one other little interesting aside to his time in America. So, he was getting married, he was buying land, he was performing on the stage, he was courting Adelina Pate. But one of the other things that he was accused of being involved in, so here again we enter the realm of rumor and speculation as opposed to fact, is being involved in the affair of the Fenian ram. All right. Well, let's start with what we do know. In 1883, while he was in the U.S., one of the other things that Count Zaharoff was involved in was that he was also agent for the Allen Steamship Company. And the Allen Steamship Company basically did a lot of travel between Boston and Galway, Ireland, and their main import were Irishmen, or in this case, largely young Irish women. So Count Zaharoff would go to Galway in Western Ireland, and he would have contracts for, to sign up essentially young Irish girls to come and work in America.
Okay.
This wasn't uncommon, and in some cases the jobs were there, seldom what you were promised. In other cases, it was a bit more tawdry than that. Just imagine you're going to convince a lot of young, naive Irish country girls to go across the Atlantic for a really good job in Boston.
Yeah.
Now, what they'll actually find on the other end could be something very different.
Yeah.
Okay. At best, work as a maid in a fancy home. At worst, drug addicted and forced into prostitution.
Yeah.
So... and there was a thriving, this is what used to be called the white slave trade.
Okay.
So it's not to say that he was, that's one of the things he might have been involved in, but so one of the things we know is that it's somehow or another, in 1883, Zaharoff, while in Galway, was threatened with death. Someone didn't like him. They're going to, either because they didn't like what he was doing with the girls, but this is where the Fenian ram aspect comes in. So there was a guy in the U.S. By the name of, I think it was John Holland, who built a submarine. One of the first John Philip Holland. And in 1881, he had built a prototype submarine, and this was really again the model of most subs to follow. And Holland himself he was a son of the sacred sod. He was from Ireland. And at this time, this is the 1880s, and what's going on in Ireland? Okay, you got the Fenians. Now, that may not mean much now, but that's essentially what would be later referred to as the IRA.
Yeah.
Okay, the IRA is the direct descendants of the Fenians. The Fenians hated the British Empire. They were another one of these armed nationalist movements who wanted to use any means possible to free Ireland from British rule. So they made a plan. They approached Holland and they bought his sub. Well, that was the idea. And then they were going to use this sub. They were going to move it. They were going to sneak it across the Atlantic. They were going to base it in a cave near Galway. And then they were going to attack British ships. Okay, just like Captain Nemo and 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea. And they were going to wreak havoc on the Royal Navy. They would have parties with shamrocks and they'd talk about all the ships that were going to sink. Okay. Leprechauns, everything. So, favorite topic of conversation in St. Patrick's Day celebrations in Boston at that point in time. Now, the problem was this. They didn't pay Holland for the submarine. Somehow the payment didn't go through. And then they just basically stole it and took it and hid it away. But there was a problem. No one knew how to operate it. So they had a sub without an operating manual, and that could be important. So it essentially sat in a barn, I think, until like 1916, until someone it may actually still be around. I'm not sure. But it just sat there for years, rusting because they didn't want Holland to get it back, but they wouldn't pay for it. So the question might be, now all of this is a matter of historical fact. The Fenian Ram was a real thing. The Irish Republican Brotherhood, which was their called at the time, essentially stole it from Holland. A brouhaha again ensued. So what might have Zaharoff had to do with this? One of his more sympathetic biographers, a fellow by the name of Alfred Alfrey, mentions just sort of as the possibility that Zaharoff was behind this coup, that Zaharoff had something to do with this. Now, here's the reason you might think that. One, he's still dealing in arms sales. And he's very, very interested in the potential of submarines. This is going to be something he's going to pay a particular attention to. So there's no way in the States that he wouldn't have noticed and wouldn't have read about this. He's also, through his connection to the Allen Steamship Company, making trips back and forth to Galway, the very place where the Irish Republican Brotherhood planned to base the Fenian Ram, or their sub, once they got a hold of it. So remember what we've decided is Zaharoff's main occupation. He is still a British agent. He's still certainly working for British intelligence. And in all likelihood, what I'd suspect is that one of the reasons why they sent him off again to the States, in addition to buy land, was also to keep an eye on what the Fenians were up to. Now this, by the way, from British policy was an important thing for them. The U.S., America at this point had more Irish than Ireland did. Mm-hmm. Because all those pissed off Irishmen that fled the famine, they all came to the States. They all still harbored a hatred for the British Empire. And much to the annoyance of the British government, the Americans just let the Fenians do whatever they wanted to. Now, somebody might look at it. In fact, armed Irishmen, thousands of them, in 1866 and 1870, tried to invade Canada from American territory.
I have not heard of that.
Yes, the Fenian invasions of Canada.
Wow.
I don't mean it was like 10 guys. It was 5,000. They had a whole army. They paraded through Philadelphia and announced their intention, and their plan was to seize Canada and ransom it for Ireland.
Wow.
And the U.S. government just sort of like, they didn't really do anything to stop it in that. They were a little annoyed with the British supporting the Confederacy, so maybe that was a part of it. Or that it was all some part of insidious American plot to use the Irish to seize Canada to give it to America. You never know.
Yeah.
But that was so what I would bet was happening, among other things, is that Zaharoff was at least aware of this whole sort of deal between the Irish Republican Brotherhood and Holland, and did his best to screw it up, to make sure that possibly by pretending to be... The other thing, remember, is that he was posing as a Russian, and the Russian Empire, which at this time was at odds with the British, how strange, was friendly to the Irish Republican Brotherhood. So he might well have said that what does my card say? I'm a former aide-de-camp to the Tsar. I can get you Russian money to maybe pay for the submarine, whatever. Mm-hmm. But yes, he's almost certainly involved in this in one form or another. Let's just stop for a moment here while I go stop dogs from barking. Okay. So in 1885, Zaharoff, whatever name he was using at the time, leaves America, apparently never to return. Where does he show up next? Spain, where there's some political things hopping. So about 1886, 1887, he's in Spain. And there he is, again, back working as an arms agent for Nordenfelt, trying to sell as much weapons as he can to the Spanish military. That's also where he encounters a woman by the name of Maria Pilar, and lots of other names, the Duchess of Villafranca y dos Caballeros, sometimes also called the Duchess of Marchena. Now, who is she? Spanish noblewoman arguably either the richest or the second richest woman in Spain. She's married, like most noble women, to a man that she hated and, like a broodmare, was married off to in a contractual wedding in order to produce an heir, which she apparently did. And she falls in love with Zaharoff and he with her, and she will become his mistress in the decades that follow. Keep that in mind. It will all come to a tragic end, but not yet. So that's where he sort of meets the love of his life. He's also probably there to spy on something. It seems that just about this time, there was a Spanish engineer by the name of Isaac Peral. And Isaac Peral had designed a submarine, a potential rival to the Holland submarine. And but Peral's invention, right after Zaharoff shows up, there was a fire at a warehouse, there was sabotage, and eventually political opposition killed the entire project, thus conveniently eliminating a challenge to the Holland submarine, which Zaharoff, yes, in due course, was to become the world's exclusive sales agent for. What a coincidence. Now, what else does he do? It's also around this time, the late 1880s, that Zaharoff now returns to Greece. He's back in Athens, almost his hometown, not quite. And he goes, and to the Greek Navy, he sells them a submarine, because this is just what Greece needs. So Greece's big rivalry is with the Ottomans. And so he goes, what the Ottomans don't have, what the Ottoman Navy is bigger, but they don't have a submarine. So you should squander a lot of money on one of these things. They do. And then what did he do next? He went to Constantinople, where he informed the Ottoman Navy that he had just sold the Greeks a submarine, a menacing new weapon, and got them to agree to buy 2. He then returned to Athens and told them that the Turks had now bought 2, so that perhaps they should increase their order to be equal with the Turks. Now that, in a simple sense, is the basis of the Zaharoff system that was arguably to become so successful. But the Zaharoff system, this seems a good time to explain that. It will more fully develop over the next decade or so. It had 4 pillars to it. Now, the main element here is to get your customers to buy as much weapons and ammunition as possible, as often as possible. But the first thing you needed to make this work was information. You needed to know who you needed, who you're going to have to talk to, who was the person who would make these decisions. And information, another way to put that, you needed intelligence. You needed spies. You needed sources of information inside the war ministries, inside the naval ministries of all the European powers to figure out what were they concerned about. So one of the ways he facilitated that would be to eventually establish his own private intelligence service, the Réseau, the Office ZZ, based in Brussels. And that was his thing. It wasn't Vickers. It wasn't any of his employers. It was his own worldwide system of collecting information to be used for weapon sales. The second pillar of the system was corruption. One of the things you're often going to have to do in order to get contracts or to get greedy bureaucrats to agree to buy your weapons as opposed to someone else was to bribe them. So you needed the money to do that. So you figured out who was bribable, or you figured out who you could have leverage against. So that's one of the things that intelligence could give you. Who's gay? Who's, involved in who's already stealing money from the government? How many ways can we manage this? So intelligence, corruption. Then the third pillar, might arguably the most important, is that if your goal is to sell lots of weapons, what do you need for that? War. You can only sell so many weapons in peace. War consumes weapons and ammunition and demands more. Nothing is more profitable from the standpoint of a merchant of death than war. So do you just wait around for wars to naturally develop? or do you instigate them? Do you use your intelligence and even your corruption in order to pit countries against each other? To sow concerns and fears? Do you arm rebel groups like Imro in order to provoke more wars? Well, that's arguably the key element of this, because it's fairly evident that's what Zaharoff did. He just didn't wait around for wars to happen. He made them happen, or he encouraged them once they were there. And then the last but not unimportant fourth pillar of the system was finance. You got a lot of countries, you got something like Montenegro, little tiny pissant Balkan country. Montenegro doesn't have a lot of money. How many weapons can they buy? Well, that's where you offer them finance. Okay, think of it this way. How today does anyone buy what you can't just go out and afford otherwise? Well, we'll loan you the money at a rate of interest. And therefore, one of the things that Zaharoff would develop a personal interest in was he essentially owned not one, but 7 banks.
Wow.
From Athens to Paris.
Jeez.
And those banks were involved, strangely enough, in military financing. So look, we're going to sell you a submarine. Can't afford it? Don't worry. We've got some low monthly payments that you can make on this sub. And if you buy 2, the payments go down even further.
Is this kind of the origin? I don't know if maybe the origin's the wrong idea, but you hear all the time conspiracy-minded folks say, "Oh, the financiers, have made money on the way up and the way down, on both sides of every war since Napoleon or before Napoleon and so on and so forth." Is that largely true, or is it more like figures like Zaharoff who are most certainly in the game of,
Well, you got to remember that Zaharoff, again, who is he? He's a person of no particular importance. He doesn't come from banking. Although remember the first place we find him in 1872, he's camped out next to the Bank of England.
Yeah.
But he has no resources of his own. It's like, again, when he's buying property in Cyprus or in America, this isn't his money. He is a tool of some larger forces. Yeah, and the thing about wars, let's put it this way, is that wars consume huge amounts of money. But that money is not put into a big pile somewhere and set on fire. It passes from one pocket to another. And generally it passes from taxpayers into the coffers of the government, then into the pocket of Zaharoff, the arms companies that he's working for. He makes huge amounts of money. I think one estimate was that by 1900 or 1905, we get to this yet. He's going to achieve his greatest fame as the world salesman for the Vickers Arms Company. And Vickers is a British concern that will absorb both Nordenfelt and Maxim. Huh. So they will control that. He will be making, by the early 20th century, an estimated, I think it's 100,000 pounds sterling a year in commissions.
Okay. Which is
it's about $20 million by current standards. So, and that's only a portion of his income, but that's just how much in commissions, which he's making on sales for Vickers at that point.
Well, I just always wondered if, that was kind of a gross generalization. It's like, oh, banks fund both sides in, every world war. It's like, well, is it indirectly? Is it on purpose? Or is it through a intermediary?
None of this stuff happens accidentally. Yeah. Okay. You just don't end up accidentally funding both sides. This is the thing you really boil down Zaharoff's system is the idea is you don't arm one side in a conflict, you arm both sides.
Right.
And thereby you double your profits. And you keep the conflict going as long as possible in order to maximize those. Yeah. Now, from the standpoint of, from the kind of basic ecology of weapon sales, that's what it's like looking at nature and arguing that, is a weasel breaking into a hen house and stealing chicks evil? No, that's just what weasels do. That's how they have to do it. It's kind of disgusting, but that's the way. So Zaharoff, this is business. War is a business.
Yeah.
and you drum up business. If there isn't a war going on, start one. Okay? And one of the ways is just to arm one contingent, start some kind of rebellion, and then keep it going, and then sell the government weapons to fight the rebels that you armed to begin with.
Okay.
It's utterly amoral, but on the other hand, it's good business, isn't it? If you want to make money, that's the way that you do it. And the thing about Zaharoff is that, he's doing this. He's very successful at it. And to a large extent, everybody can see what he's doing. And he gets away with it because it's not just him. This isn't just one sort of like rogue weapon salesman who's off doing this and everyone's aghast about it. No, he's doing exactly what his British controllers wanted to do. And he's getting very rich in the process. So he's now eventually, in I think 1888 is the key year in which he really becomes the merchant of death. Nordenfelt merges with Hiram Maxim, according to the sales on machine guns, the weapon of the future. And then eventually that will lead to their absorption by Vickers, which will go into the armaments business. And Vickers builds, that builds ships for the Royal Navy. It builds cannons. It builds armor plates, everything. And this also begins this process of licensing different military technology to be produced in other countries. So one of the things, the Maxim gun is an interesting example. And the typical sort of Maxim gun, call that because of its inventor, Maxim, is sort of the old style machine gun you still see in movies. It looks like it has a very big barrel. What it's got is a water-cooled jacket around the barrel. And that keeps it quite cool. And one of the reasons is that it can fire continuously without overheating. Very efficient, basically the model for all subsequent machine guns from that point on. But licenses to manufacture that design are sold to most countries. So by the time you get to the First World War, and you look at a German Maxim gun, a British, you look at the Russians, it's essentially the same weapon, which is then being produced under license in those countries. Now, whoever it is who holds the license makes money on every one of those. It's even the case in terms of artillery fuses. There was a particular artillery fuse that I think was first... I think it was a German patent that was then acquired through a Vickers subsidiary in Germany, and it was then used, I don't remember, in British artillery shells in the First World War. And after the First World War, the German company that held the actual copyright to that fuse sued successfully the British in order to be paid for every one of those fuses used in every of the millions of shells that were used to bombard German troops on the Western Front. Wow. Because that's business. Yeah. That's the way these things. Gentlemen, this is business. A license was sold, and it doesn't matter who the shell was fired at. It doesn't matter who the bullet hits. It matters who held the license to manufacture that weapon. And that's another one of the things that Zaharoff will be very effective in sort of setting up these deals between the company. That's even led some people to suppose, and I wouldn't put it past him, that if you notice his connection first to Nordenfelt, then with Maxim, then with Vickers, and that both of those companies then end up as subsidiaries of Vickers was the plan all along. That he, as a British agent, was set in to essentially take over those companies as salesmen and lead them into the arms of Vickers, thus consolidating a bigger and bigger sort of 500-pound gorilla of weapons manufacturing. And he becomes the exclusive world agent. There are other salesmen, but he could go anywhere in the world and sell the weapons. In fact, his title was, for Vickers, General Representative for Business Abroad. Could go anywhere and sell anything. So What then follows, there's a whole series of things. I mean, there in the early 20th century, you've got a revolution in Turkey planted in Masonic lodges, the so-called Young Turk Revolution, which leads to more wars. You got the First Balkan War, you got the Second Balkan War, and Zaharoff and Vickers are there at every step of the way, selling every bullet, pistol, rifle, and machine gun they can to all of the participants. You just don't sell to the Serbians. You sell to the Serbians and the Bulgarians and the Romanians and the Greeks and the Turks. Anybody who's fighting, anybody who needs weapons, you're there to supply them. Now, by the time you get to the First World War, Zaharoff has become rich. He has also become a French citizen. Remember, we started out by saying he wanted to get French citizenship, and that ran into this little issue of a birth certificate, which he solved by conjuring one out of thin air. He's established a kind of base for himself in Paris. He has a nice apartment and office building, I think, at 54 Rue de Bienfaisance. He'll also buy a chateau, the Chateau du Balancourt, 50 miles south of Paris. He also gets very, very interested in Monte Carlo and the little Principality of Monaco, which, wait a second, he'll eventually take over as his own little private country.
Wow.
I mean, it's easy to do. It's not very big. But he becomes good friends with the Prince, Louis II of Monaco, and will do him lots of favors. And this sort of gets into the 20s. But Zaharoff has now become wealthy. He has diversified into banking. So said that he'll eventually be essentially the owner or chief shareholder in 7 banks from the Balkans to France. He'll also get very interested in oil. Warships need oil to run on. Everything needs lubrication. So he's a kind of pioneer in oil exploration. Also, radio was something else. During the First World War, he'll form a thing called the Agence Radio in the Balkans to broadcast pro-Allied propaganda in Greek. He'll play a backroom deal in... this is the story in and of itself. Greece during World War I is kind of a mess. You've got the king. You've got a powerful politician by the name of Venizelos. Venizelos is a friend of Zaharoff. Eventually, there are coups and revolutions. The king is overthrown. Zaharoff is placed in control. And Greece will end the war on the Allied side. Doesn't start that way. And everyone then later largely credits Zaharoff with maneuvering Greece into the Allied side.
So Zaharoff is placed in charge of Greece?
No, he isn't placed. Venizelos.
Oh, okay.
His friend is placed in charge. Okay. Although Zaharoff, practically speaking, is probably involved. Okay. So he stage manages Greece's entrance into World War I. And in doing so, makes himself a political force behind the scenes. Whether it's the king or, the struggle in Greece will be between the monarchists and the republicans, and it's god-awful. They just go back and forth.
Okay.
The term shit show could be used in some cases, but it's a problem. But it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter whether the king's in charge or whether Venizelos is in charge. It just matters, are they going to buy weapons and munitions?
Yeah.
So the two, there are lots of things going. I'm skipping over a lot of stuff because we don't have time to go into all of it. But this is an oversimplification of his role. Remember, Zaharoff by birth is an Ottoman subject. And even though he's become a French citizen, he's still an Ottoman subject, and he has some links there. So during the First World War, the Ottoman Empire becomes allied with Germany and Austria. It's an enemy of Britain. This is, Lawrence of Arabia. Okay, all of this stuff is going on. So the British are busily trying to gobble up all of the Ottoman Middle East. They invade Iraq and they invade Palestine. And towards the end of the war, in late 1918, the Turks are pretty much on the ropes. But the war is still going on. And this is where, doing some research some years back in the House of Lords Record Office in London, I came across a whole series of exchanges in October 1918 Basically, they're all filed away in David Lloyd George's, the then British Prime Minister's, personal papers, the David Lloyd George collection. And the communications are basically between Lloyd George and a fellow by the name of Vincent Collard. And Vincent Collard is both the General Secretary of Vickers, close friend of Zaharoff. And what they're talking about is using Basil Zaharoff to bribe Ottoman officials to leave the war, to pay the Turks to conclude an armistice. And the date on one of these is around the 23rd or 24th of October. And the Turks do indeed conclude an armistice on the 30th or the 31st. So they're talking about something that actually happens. But it sort of explains why this happened. So the whole issue in these communications is that apparently Zaharoff had been asked by Lloyd George and the British War Cabinet to deliver £600,000 to some unnamed Ottoman officials in Switzerland in order to get the armistice. But some snafu has come up because Zaharoff has decided that he does not want to use his own money to do this. Now, the British want him to use his own money because they never want to admit that they bribed the Turks out of the war. They don't want to use His Majesty's funds. They don't want to use, so they want Zaharoff. They're basically, go in, you got £600,000 in the bank, pay the Turks off, get them out of the war, and we'll reimburse you. Zaharoff won't do this. He wants the money from the Brits to pay to the Turks. He's not going to use his own money. And so he just basically says, well, unless you do that, essentially, I'm going to cancel the check. I'm not going to do it. I'm going to walk out on this whole deal. Now, here's what's important to me. Here's a man who is essentially an arms salesman, a rich one, but an arms salesman, who has now been approached by His Majesty's government to bribe a foreign adversary out of a conflict. They ask him. They don't demand that he do this. And when he becomes upset over the fact that he's expected to do this with his own money, he just says no. And they apparently recant. He can give his own terms. You have to think about it in this case. In 1918, the British government was still single-handedly, pound for pound, probably the most powerful political entity on earth. Not exactly what it was going to be in a few years, but, they hadn't quite gone broke yet. And Basil Zaharoff is in a position where not only do they ask him pretty please to do things, but that he can turn around and essentially tell the British Prime Minister and the whole War Cabinet and the King to go screw yourselves if you don't give me the money up front. Now that is a tremendous increase from someone who was born in obscurity somewhere in the Greek quarter of Constantinople, wherever it was. How many people, how many mere mortals can have that power? And keep in mind, he's not a politician. He's never been elected to office. He's not from the nobility. He has no social standing. The key thing to me, if you think about it, is that this is the kind of power that comes not just from money. Because Zaharoff is rich, but there actually probably are people who are richer than he is. He's got a lot of money, but he doesn't have all the money in the world. So what does he have? What is the power that allows him to simply be treated by the British government as if he is a kind of sovereign entity all his own? It's not his money. And this is where you come back, and we'll revisit it again, to René Guénon, the French occultist view that Zaharoff was mixed up with something much more important about that. That he has been admitted as a member of, the best way to put it, the secret lodge, the High Lodge, a lodge of what you don't actually know. Let's just call it the Illuminati. That he has now been promoted to the Illuminati, and you don't mess around with a senior Illuminatus. That in some way, he is more powerful than the Prime Minister of England, even perhaps more powerful than the King. and how he got that way, starting as a kind of errand boy, is the great unanswered question in this whole story. Because what I'm recounting here, mostly from what we know in some kind of public record, either in documents or in the press, is the part, remember, that we can see. But there's something going on. There's something that's happened by this point that we haven't seen, which has now elevated this basic nobody into a position of power without any apparent basis for it. So that's one, this sort of bribing the Turks out of the war is one portion of it. Then after the war, having essentially become the dominant political force in Greece, he now persuades the Greek government to pursue what's called the Megali Idea, the big idea. And in Greek nationalism, the big idea is not just the independence of Greece, it is the restoration of the Byzantine Empire with Constantinople as its capital. That means conquering Turkey.
Yeah.
It means invading Anatolia, throwing the entire Greek army into the Asian mainland, waging a war with the Turkish nationalists, taking Ankara and Constantinople and recreating the Eastern Orthodox Empire. And that's what the Greeks do. And so beginning in 1919 through 1922, the Greek army fights the Anatolian War, which proves to be an utter disaster, a catastrophe. It is one of the few things that Zaharoff fails at, and yet on the other hand, he's arming probably both sides. Gets involved in a lot of other things as well. After the First World War is over, there's a lot of weapons left over. So here's the case. Germany was defeated, and there's the Versailles Treaty, and the Versailles Treaty limits Germany to a small army. It can't have more than 100,000 men. And the Germans, under the terms of the Versailles Treaty, also have to turn over all the excess weapon because they've got thousands of machine guns and artillery pieces and a lot of munitions that this little army can't use anymore. So one story you get is that all of those weapons are taken by the Allies and destroyed. We're going to melt down all the machine guns, and they can't. Now, would you do that?
No.
Why? Because those weapons are worth much more as weapons than they are as scrap metal. So no, only a very small token number, let's say, of German excess machine guns are destroyed. Instead, they end up on the surplus market. And that's another great advantage for Zaharoff. Come in, and he's in Germany post-war buying up all the stocks of munitions and weapons that are available, and then selling them. To who? Well, in one little trail, he sells them to, I don't know, who's kind of a pariah that needs weapons at this point? Oh, the Bolsheviks.
Yeah.
Okay, nobody wants to talk to the Bolsheviks.
Yeah.
Except to make money. Okay, that's the one thing you find. Nobody wants to recognize the Soviet regime unless we can make money off of them. So Zaharoff goes to post-war Germany, buys up weapons, sells them to the Reds. They can't use any of them. And then they, during this Greco-Turkish war in the early 20s, sell them to Ataturk and the Turks. Mm. So Zaharoff, again, is both fomenting a war between the Greeks and the Turks, and he is arming both sides. He would rather that the Greeks win, or maybe that made no particular difference to him one way or the other. But it's also around this time, 1920, that he takes a particular interest in Monaco. Now, Monaco is a tiny little principality. It's not much more than several streets and a kind of crappy harbor. I've been there. I was thoroughly unimpressed. I don't know what I expected out of Monaco, but certainly more. Okay, the whole palace looks like a, Bel Air, California tract house. Anyway, it's just, okay, kind of fancy, but nothing that much. So it's not really the size of Monaco. It's the fact that it's a sovereign state and with its own prince. And most of the money from Monaco, then and now, came from the Monte Carlo casino. So Monte Carlo is is it a town? Kind of the main part of Monaco. And the casino is where it comes from. And there's a company which owns the casino, which is the Société de Bain de Mer, the sea baths, because apparently people used to go swimming in the ocean, and then they would go gamble. Zaharoff is not a gambler. He's not that stupid. He doesn't gamble. But he realizes that other people do. So one of the things that had happened in 1920 is that the new Prince of Monaco, Louis II, had realized that the casino wasn't making that much money anymore, and he needed some more. And the casino for years had been run by the Blanc family. And the manager of the casino and the society that ran it was a fellow by the name of Camille Blanc, who was probably skimming as much as he possibly could. Zaharoff moves in. Blanc is moved out. Zaharoff buys up a majority of shares in the managing society and refurbishes the casino, and within 3 years, it has tripled its revenue. Louis is grateful. And Zaharoff will kind of move into Monaco and make this his capital. Now, that much is all a matter of record. The rumors, the speculation about what he wanted to do is that he wanted to turn Monaco into his own sort of private, a country that he could use as his base. There would be a prince, but he would effectively be the ruler of it, and he could do whatever he wanted within this. So one of the things that Zaharoff is credited with by some people is creating the Monégasque, that is the Monaco Intelligence Service. And yes, they have one. It still exists. Why? Why does Monaco, a cheese box on a raft with a casino, okay, why? The cheese box on a mountain, which is, it's, okay, but they have their own, and that he set this up simply as a vehicle for his own intelligence service, but he now gave it a national base. Another was that he wanted to install, that he was essentially going to buy the whole principality from Louis and then install his Spanish Duchess mistress as the queen, because that's what she should be. She should be the queen of her own little country. And that's possible, but he does kind of move in. Another third idea was that he wanted to turn Monaco into a Masonic state. This is the idea. Zaharoff himself is the member of at least 3 different Masonic lodges, from Athens to London and other in Paris. So he is involved in that. How important is it? You don't know. That he was now going to turn this into a kind of little, a Masonic country. I don't know what that would be.
The United States?
Yeah, the United States. I mean, isn't there already one?
I know, right?
Okay. Well, there's a Masonic Republic. We need a Masonic Principality.
Yeah, there you go.
What makes me question part of that is that having restored Monaco's finances, so in 1924, his Spanish wife is, not wife, his mistress. She will be his wife. She was married. She hated her husband, who apparently was a thorough sadistic creep. But nevertheless, she's a Catholic. And that means that even if you're married to a sadistic creep, you're married until they die. He died. She was free. In 1924, they marry. Keep in mind, he's now in his 70s. She's almost as old. And they live in wedded bliss in Monaco for 18 months until she dies. So again, third marriage doesn't. And around the same time, Zaharoff seems to lose interest in Monaco. He sells off his shares in the casino, pocketing a handsome profit from that. And the following year, in 1927, he makes a public announcement that he has destroyed his private diaries. Now, this is kind of interesting. So, throughout his whole career, supposedly, starting when? We don't know. He had kept a diary. And this diary recorded his appointments, his meetings, who he did business with. Imagine all of the different secrets that were in that. And he said he had been approached many times by people who wanted to publish these diaries or wanted to see them, and he had never let anyone see them. And he now decided that, as old as he was, that he was just kind of generally pissed off with humanity in general. And he wasn't given the satisfaction of doing that, and he was going to destroy them. And he had destroyed them. Now, to some people, that was probably a great relief. Because, again, you would have to imagine that if the diaries existed, all he had to do was claim they did. Well, here again, you have that thing of leverage. Okay, think of Zaharoff's diaries as like Epstein's list, his appointment book, all of the little films and videos that he had. You don't actually have to use the blackmail. Simply, its existence is implicit. So why would he make a public declaration that he had destroyed this so potentially valuable source of information? The best bet is that he didn't destroy it, but he somehow wanted it to be put out that he had. After this point, he becomes increasingly a kind of recluse. He spends much of his time at his chateau in Balancourt. By this time, he is guarded night and day by a squad of Sikhs, Indians with turbans. Why them? Well, I think it's the British thing. So he's got this whole sort of, goon squad, guard squad of Sikhs who are always around him. And he largely travels between Balancourt and Monaco, splitting his time depending upon the seasons that you have. It's also only later in his life that he lets himself be photographed. There are very few photographs of Zaharoff. And most of the ones that you'll see, like the one in the thumbnail, were all taken in the late 20s. Early in his life, there are virtually no photos. Supposedly he was very adverse to having his picture taken. And on some occasions when someone, a newspaperman would take his picture, that would either have that forcibly taken from him and the camera smashed, or he would be paid a fair amount of money to turn over the picture. Why? What's the whole point of that? There are two explanations for that. One is that Zaharoff, for some very good reason, didn't want to have his visage plastered around, at least until he was too old to be recognizable, for fear he would be recognized by someone. Another ex-wife somewhere? Who knows? The second, more intriguing reason, I don't put much credence in as there, is that it had to do with the occult implication of photographs. That you never allow your image to be controlled by other people. That can be used in certain ritual procedures that can be... By the way, Stalin was explicitly warned against the same thing by a psychic he brought in. I don't know how much attention he paid to her, but she said that he should never let his picture be taken or any picture of him be taken outside of it. Hence actually arguing that much of the pictures of Stalin in the 30s are of Stalin's double as opposed to actually Stalin himself. I don't know. It's a good story. But it's not to say that some people didn't believe that type of thing. So still he's active in it. I think in 1934 in the U.S., the U.S. Senate there's the whole sort of Nye committee that looks into things like war profiteering. This was all part of the kind of anti-war sentiment that was going through, and Senator Nye, this whole investigation. Were people making lots of money off of arms and war? Yeah, and one of the names that kept coming up was, guess whose? Basil Zaharoff. I think they tried to subpoena him to testify before Congress. That was not going to work. But nonetheless, his name would surface in Washington during the Nye committee hearings about war profiteering because there was no war profiteer bigger than him. He's also connected to an event that may or may not have happened. Now, there were people, and this had to do with, it goes back to World War I. In June 1916, the British War Secretary, Lord Kitchener, Horatio Horace Kitchener, hero, the living embodiment of British imperial militarism, got on the cruiser Hampshire in the Orkneys, and he was going to make a voyage to the Russian port of Archangel. He was on a secret mission to Russia. He was going to go see the Tsar. It was part of this, and supposedly he was carrying with him 15,000 pounds of gold bullion, which is going to be delivered to the Tsar as a kind of bribe to keep the Russians in the war. And the Hampshire sank soon after leaving. It ran into a storm, so there are different stories as to what happened. This is what we know what happened. The Hampshire sank, and Kitchener and almost everyone on board were lost. It might have been sunk. There were stories that it was sunk by a German submarine, that it was sunk by a German mine, that it simply was sunk because it was overwhelmed by the rough seas. In the end, it probably doesn't matter. Oh, I guess another story was sabotaged. And there was a guy who claimed to have planted the bomb aboard the Hampshire. But the Hampshire was lost. Kitchener was lost. This was a huge blow to British morale, at least temporarily. But there was that whole question. What attracted Zaharoff's attention? At 15,000 pounds of gold. And according to a guy who was indeed a diver in that period, he goes, he was paid. He figured out it was by Zaharoff to go with a team out and to dive and to recover the 6 safes in which this gold was held. And he was paid a large amount of money to do that. And then he turned the gold over somebody, and that was it. And all he was told was that Zaharoff was the one who paid for it. Could be true. Nobody's much going to talk about it. Was that just Zaharoff who wanted the gold, or was he recovering it for someone else? Or the other story, was the gold just a cover for something else that was aboard the Hampshire? Because you see, people would believe it if you told them you were going after 15,000 pounds of gold. Whereas maybe what you were after was a document, something else. I don't know, a secret icon with an engraving about the green dragon. Who knows? Okay. The secret to the man with the green gloves? Who knows what they were after? And then eventually, in 1936, it was announced in the press that Basil Zaharoff had died in Monaco after a sudden illness. And that he was then supposedly entombed in his chateau at Balancourt. And there are some questions about that. One of the things that Zaharoff was also supposedly concerned about was whether or not his body would be molested after death. That someone might try to steal it. For what purposes? I don't know. What could you do with his corpse? And it's now, within the last decade, and I'm going to have to be vague on this, so I'm not going to mention, and I don't know whether this actually happened. Someone told me that it happened. There was a particular Swiss researcher who was very interested in this, in the whole case with Zaharoff. And the question was where his body was actually interred. Was it interred in Monaco, or was it interred at the tomb in Balancourt? So the way to figure that out was to break in to the chateau, open the tomb, and see if his body was in it. And they did that, and the coffin was empty. There was no corpse inside, which then leads to one of two conclusions, arguably. One, that Zaharoff's body, that was, all to distract people, that he's actually buried in Monaco or God knows where else, or that he's immortal and never died at all. Because yes, someone has alleged that. He just decided it was to leave this and go back somewhere. But it shows, so anyway, this kind of brings us back to the thing I mentioned in the beginning, the French occultist René Guénon, who is the one who believes that Zaharoff was some kind of powerful occult adept, either in some kind of, the higher lodge, whatever it is. He can never quite put his finger on it. He thinks, for instance, that he specifically identifies him with Master R, or Master Rakosi, which is one of the ascended masters in theosophy. Okay, the Rakosi name actually comes from a Hungarian noble family that used to rule Transylvania. Oh. There's a whole line of those. And well, there's an interesting little side story there. And this goes in, this was one of, I don't even think that Guénon took that seriously, but he was willing to repeat it. It all goes back to this question as to how things kind of got started and where Zaharoff was schooled. It wasn't at Rugby, where he learned English, how he got the introduction to important people. And this story fantastically argues that his schooling took place at a thing called the Scholomance, or the Scholomance, which is a kind of diabolical Hogwarts hidden in the Carpathian Mountains of Transylvania, somewhere near a forbidden lake.
Okay.
Now, in the original legends, it is a school of wizards run by Satan himself.
Okay, all right.
And that there are only 9 admitted at any particular time, and they learn all sorts of secrets and how to control the weather and do the rest of it. And, that doesn't seem terribly likely. What's interesting, and I think maybe at this point you can understand, as to why even that fantastic of a story would be told about Basil Zaharoff. Because remember, when you do not have anything else to explain it, even the most fantastic explanation is at least an explanation. But Guénon is where Guénon seems to be someone who's worried about a lot of things and people. He also tended to have a low opinion of a lot of the people around him. So, for instance, René Guénon thought that Aleister Crowley was, as he put it, a spy and a crook.
Well, that's kind of true.
Which is pretty much accurate, all right?
Sort of.
We can quibble with the crook part, the spy not. But he had him pegged pretty well. So one shouldn't perhaps be too quick to ignore anything that he has to say about Zaharoff. Guénon had his fingers on the sort of spider web of occult Europe. I mean, things that float, from the Polaires to the Green Dragon to all the rest of this. He picked up a lot of rumors and information. Some of it accurate, probably some of it inaccurate. But he could assess much of that. To me, Guénon seems slightly paranoid, but the thing about paranoids is that they're often right. So, okay, that's the thing to remember. Just because he's crazy doesn't mean he's wrong. And I don't even think Guénon was crazy. Guénon was perhaps inclined to see things that weren't there, but he's also seeing things that are there.
Yeah.
So I think in the broad outline that part of Zaharoff's power, part of the way again that he could thumb his nose at British imperialism in 1918, that he could effectively take over a small country, that he had so leveraged that you cannot explain his power influence by money alone. There's some other factor at work. And in that case, I don't think the concept of an occult factor, that his connection with some sort of larger mystical or occult underground in Europe, can be dismissed. There's something to that. Now, by the way, someone else who thought that was another Spanish noblewoman, I think actually a cousin of his mistress, the Infanta Eulalia of Spain, sister of the Spanish king. Or one of the Alfonsos. I don't know. And she outright calls him, says that Zaharoff was one of the main manifestations of the occult forces controlling Europe. Now, the question is, what did she actually mean? Did she just mean hidden forces? Yeah. Or did she mean woo-woo?
Yeah.
Cool. This is where we'll have to distinguish between just occult is hidden and occult woo-woo.
Yeah.
Either one of those could be the case in this. But this is, in way of a conclusion, why I think Zaharoff's story and his role is important and it's worth looking at. Because here again, you have the example of someone who comes from obscure, unimportant origins, and through a means not visible or fully comprehensible, achieves a position of great wealth, but more important than the money. The money isn't what you look at. It's the power that you have. And that's the kind of enduring mystery of the mystery man of Europe and the merchant of death. Sir, because he got 2 knighthoods, even though both were honorary. Sir Basil Zaharoff.